welcome to 3Q, where I interview industry professionals for just 15 minutes by asking three powerful questions. I'm your host, Rachel Vogel, and joining me on tonight's episode is Pete Ganbarg, the president of Pure Tone Music. Pete is a two-time Grammy Award-winning record producer and A&R executive. He most recently served as president of A&R for Atlantic Records. Pete spent the last 35 years as a senior A&R executive for major label groups including Arista, Epic, and EMI. Some of the artists that he's worked with in his career include Santana, Lin-Manuel Miranda, as well as 21 Pilots, Christina Perri, Melanie Martinez, and hit Broadway cast recordings and film soundtracks like Dear Evan Hansen, Mean Girls, and The Greatest Showman. His 2 Grammy Awards come from his role as producer on the original Broadway cast recording of Dear Evan Hansen and the original Broadway cast recording of Jagged Little Pill. Plus, he was named International Music Person of the Year for 2023 by the music industry organization Music Expo and currently serves as a member of the board of directors of the Songwriters Hall of Fame. So, Pete, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on. How's it going?
It's going well, Rachel. Good to be here.
Very excited to have you as a guest. Are you ready for your first question?
Ready when you are.
Here we go. Imagine for a second you are sitting down with your 25-year-old self. What one piece of advice would you give him on a personal note, and what one piece of advice would you give him from a business perspective?
Well, I am taking you literally at this question. So, since I'm over the age of 25, I can go back in time and remember exactly where I was when I was 25 and what year it was and what was going on. And so I am literally, in my mind, transporting myself to that year when I answer this question. So the first answer is the personal one. So if I'm sitting down with my 25-year-old self, the advice on the personal side would be don't give up, eyes on the prize. And it's specifically talking about somebody that I was interested in dating, but that person kept turning me down. And I wasn't interested in dating anyone else. I was only interested in dating her. And she kept saying no. So this was right at the time that my 25-year-old self would be, completely pulling the hair out of his head because he didn't know what to do. And so my advice would be eyes on the prize. It's maybe one step forward and 2 steps back, but eyes on the prize, keep going, because we're recording this now in March of 2025, and in 3 months, that crush and I will be married 30 years. So there you go.
I knew that was coming. I love that.
And then on the professional side, I would tell my 25-year-old self that even though it's tempting, it's not about the money. Sometimes you may, 25-year-old self, be in a position where someone is offering you a lot of money or a lot more than somebody else, and it doesn't feel right in your gut to do it. And 25-year-old self, if it doesn't feel right in your gut, don't do it. That would be the advice. It's not about the money.
That's really great advice. I have a question that I want to ask you about your producer life. So, how do you feel that having the skill set of being a producer has helped propel you in the music business as an executive and in the role of an A&R throughout the years?
It's really, the titles don't mean anything, the words don't mean anything. It comes down to what your skill set is. And my skill set is I'm a very analytical listener, right? So I don't listen casually. I'm not the type of person who would be vacuuming, and whistling and the music's on in the background, competing with the vacuum. If I'm listening, I'm analyzing. And it's sometimes annoying to the people I'm with who are listening much more casually because I'm, going through 20 questions about every song I'm hearing. Do I like this song? If not, could I have an idea to make this song better? How's the lyric? How's the production? What's the singer like? Like all these things. And so that is the skill set that a producer uses when a producer's in the studio. It's basically you're listening very, very, very carefully. And you want to make sure that ultimately what the artist in the studio is doing is going to connect with the audience who is the bullseye target for that audience, for that artist. And every artist is going to have a different bullseye target audience. So my job is to help connect the two. I've compared myself to a Sherpa sometimes because it's, the artist is on one side, the audience is on the other side. And in order to get there, sometimes it's like climbing Mount Everest. And sometimes we never make it, we die in an avalanche. But the times that we do make it and we get to the top of the mountain and that audience is waiting for us, it's a hell of a
It's about the journey, you know?
thing.
Now, before we dive into the next question, did you grow up with like a musical background? Did you always see yourself being kind of immersed in the music world?
No, I didn't. I really had no family who was musically inclined, and it kind of just came to me. But once it came to me, I was able to connect the dots with family relationships later on. Like my dad's best friend in the 1920s, growing up in Manhattan, turned out to be one of the most legendary executives in the history of Atlantic Records, but I didn't know that. I didn't know it until a lot later. So when I got the job to be the head of the A&R department at Atlantic Records, and for the 16 years that I sat in that chair as head of A&R, I was over, there were literally photos on the wall of my dad's friend that I would walk by every day. And that was great because it was not something I set out to do, but it was something that was there, literally looking down at me from the walls every day.
That's really cool. That's what we call invisible string.
Yeah, 100%.
All right, next question. Every industry has its dirty little secrets, and we all know that's no different in the music industry. Sometimes people think that's a bad thing, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they can be good. So, what's one secret you'd like to share with our listeners about the industry?
Okay, here's a secret. The secret is that it's actually not hard to succeed in the music business. And people may see, I teach college classes, and the kids are always coming up to me. They're like, nobody returns my phone calls, and I can't get an internship, and nobody returns my emails. It's actually not hard to succeed in the music business. You've just got to be very strategic and very smart and work really, really, really hard and don't give up. If that means sending out 100 messages, expect to get no responses 99% of the time. But if you get the one response, that's all you need. All you need is to get your foot in the door. And when I say that you've got to work really, really, really hard, my mentor in the business is Clive Davis. I worked for him for 11 years on and off in the 90s and into the mid 2000s. And he worked harder than anybody else when he didn't have to. Clive literally is now 90. I will tell you exactly how I know this. He is 92 years old. He's going to turn 93 in a couple of weeks. And he still listens to 15 to 20 brand new songs every week. Why does he have to? He's 92. He doesn't have anything to prove to anybody, but he does it because it's a part of who he is. It's because he wants to know what is popular and why it's popular. What is popular is easy to find out because you can go on to, the top 50 on Spotify. That's what's popular. But then when you listen to it, that's when your brain and your ear tells you, all right, this is popular. Now we've got to figure out why it's popular, right? Why does the audience want this? Why are they choosing to listen to this instead of something else, right? So the other secret is that your opinion as an A&R person does not matter at all. The only opinion that matters is the audience's opinion. So your job is to make sure the audience has what it wants, even if it doesn't know what it wants. Your job is to get them to a place where they thought this was what they wanted all along. And those are the invisible strings that you're talking about. The most successful that I can be is to work so hard on a project, to put my fingerprints all over it, and then they all disappear once it's out in the world, you know. So the biggest thrill that I can have as an A&R person, because obviously, no one's going to, see me on the street and know who I am, which I prefer, versus an artist I work with who, could be recognized at any moment, depending on how visible they are. The best feeling that I can get is when I'm walking down the street and someone is singing a song that I worked on. And or you're driving in the car and the next car next to you has the window down and they're bopping to a song that you kind of resuscitated, that it was on its deathbed, and you took out the paddles as the A&R person and you saved it, and now it's their favorite song. That's the best feeling in the world.
Yeah, that's a really cool perspective. You touched on mentorship a little bit. So before we dive into the next question, I'm curious your take on the importance of mentorship for both rising executives and people just getting started in the music business, and artists just looking to find mentors in terms of whether it's producers or executives or other people in the business.
It's really important, really, really important. There's a phrase in I think it's in Hebrew. I was going to say it's in Yiddish, but I think it's in Hebrew. Lador v'dor, going from generation to generation. And we are obligated to make sure that the future um, is well positioned, the future of the industry is well positioned to take it to the next level. The mentors that I've had in this business took a chance on me when maybe I didn't deserve that chance. I mentioned Clive Davis earlier. I had 2 job interviews with him before I got hired to work for him. And the 2 interviews could not have gone worse. Everything that he asked me and I answered, he disagreed with. Everything he played me and I liked, he disagreed with. Everything he played me and I disliked, he disagreed with. And I think it was almost like he was testing me. And when I got the call that he was offering me the job, I thought somebody was playing a joke on me. That's how bad the interviews went. But he ended up becoming the greatest mentor, because when you do A&R for somebody like Clive, you end up spending a lot of time with him, because every day is an A&R meeting that lasts all day and you're just stuck in his office, but you're learning by osmosis. So we would be in his office all day when he was on the phone with Aretha Franklin, when he was on the phone with Whitney Houston, and we would be privy to those conversations. And we would hear him, analyze the questions that the artist had for him and how he would respond and how he would creatively solve the problem. And that's something that, every day when I'm listening to a song or talking to an artist, there's nothing that I say to them that one part of it I didn't learn, in my dozen years or so working with Clive. And so when I got to Atlantic in a position to really reconfigure the staff of an A&R department, I made sure that I would try to do the same thing. And so I hired 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds. We didn't get it right all the time. They're not all there still, but the 2 guys who are running the department at Atlantic, who kind of took the baton, from me when I passed it to them, are guys that I hired, one at 16 and one at 20. So I think it's super, super important, whether they appreciate, all the times I sent them back 100 times to get it better or not. I think they're better at their jobs because of that.
That's really important. All right, next question. Throughout your career, I'm sure you've been asked plenty of questions, whether it's been for an industry conference, the media, or even a promotion. But throughout all of those interviews and all of those questions, there has to be one that you've never been asked but would have liked to. So, what is that question, and what would be your answer?
So I think the question is, you are growing up as a kid, you have your entire life ahead of you. You can choose to do whatever it is you want on this journey. So why music? For me, I'm not a musician. I'm not a songwriter. I'm not a singer. I'm not an artist. Why music? I don't think that I chose music. I think music chose me. And the reason that I think that is I once walked into a psychic's office around the same time that I was having these horrible job interviews with Clive Davis. And I walked into the psychic's office, and the psychic did not know my name, just knew my first name, did not know my last name. And this was a long time ago, so there was no internet, there was nothing. I walked in and she stares at me. And the first thing out of her mouth is, "What's with all the music?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "There's music all around you. What is that about?" And so I think that, again, it's like I didn't choose it. It chose me, because when I graduated college, I actually did not major in anything that had to do with music. I majored in English. I majored in education. I got a degree to teach high school English. And I chose not to teach. I chose to take an offer for a radio promotion job at an independent record label in New York City, paying me $17,000 a year. And I did it just because it felt like I had to. And if I hadn't done that, my life would be completely different, you know? So, I don't think anyone has asked me that question exactly the way that I just phrased it, but that's what I would have asked. That's how I would have answered it.
Wow. So real quick, before we close it out, you are the founder and host of the Rock and Roll High School podcast. So what enticed you to get into the world of podcasting? And tell us a little bit about it.
Again, I didn't choose it. It chose me, because going back to mentoring, one of my young A&R people proved to me very vividly one day that he did not know anything about the history of music that went back more than 5 or 10 years. And I said, "How can you be an A&R person and not know the history of music that goes back to the beginning of, at least the rock and roll era and the beginning of Rock Around the Clock and Elvis in 1955?" And he said to me, he's like, "Pete, you don't understand, nobody my age knows that. Nobody. And I'll prove it to you." And he grabbed 10 young employees at Atlantic at the time. This was a little while ago, 10, 15 years ago. And he said, he was 20, they were 20. And he's like, "I'm going to prove it to you." And he brings 10 people into the office, and I start asking them the basics of music history, and nobody knew anything. And I was like, wow, this is scary. So as a public service, I'm going to dust off that teaching degree that I told you about, and I am going to start teaching you guys about the history of music. And I said to, all of them except the one guy who worked directly for me, I said, "It's optional for all of you." And then I pointed at him and I said, "For you, it's mandatory." And so the first day that we did it, we ordered pizzas and beers, and everybody came, and I started, teaching class. Like, this is Chuck Berry, this is James Brown, this is Little Richard, these are the Everly Brothers, this is Buddy Holly. And people liked it. It's not like they didn't want to know it, they just have never been taught it before. So as we kept going chronologically, more and more people started coming to the class. So by the time that we got to the current day, there were probably, somewhere between 50 and 100 employees coming. And I'm like, wow, they really want to learn. So we should do something about this. And I ran in an airport, I ran into a drummer who was one of the first rock artists ever signed to Atlantic Records. And I said to him, I said, "How'd you like to come and speak to this little class that I'm doing at Atlantic about the history of music? Because, you were the drummer in Vanilla Fudge, the first rock band ever signed to Atlantic." And he's like, "Yeah, I'd love to." So he came in, and everyone loved it. And then I started calling, people like him, and they started coming in. And then, the guests got bigger and bigger. We had Clive Davis, and we had Graham Nash, and we had all these people start coming in, and it was awesome. And then when the pandemic happened, the head of global HR for the Warner Music Group called me and said, "That class that you do," because now it was becoming a thing, when you have Clive Davis and Graham Nash and all these amazing Gamble and Huff, and like all these amazing guests, the word starts getting out. And now that everybody was working remote, she said, "Do you think you can do that, but do it on Zoom?" And I said, "Sure, I can do it on Zoom. But if I'm doing it on Zoom, I'm saying to myself, I could just press record and repurpose it as a podcast." So we're now in our fourth season. We're over 50 episodes. And I'm really, really glad we've done it because unfortunately, as our guests get older, some of them have passed away since I've interviewed them, and their stories are now with us forever. And it's a great feeling.
That's really cool. Well, congrats on that. It's about time we close out tonight's episode. So, Pete, thanks again for joining me. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
It's been my pleasure, and I wish you very well with the podcast, and happy to have been a guest.
To everyone listening, I hope you enjoyed tonight's episode. Stay tuned for next week of 3Q, where I interview industry professionals for just 15 minutes by asking 3 powerful questions. See you next time.